Today we're going to talk about estate planning, which is basically asset protection and creating probate planning and your wills and all the documents that come along with estate planning. Really, in effect, make sure that the financial plan that you've built and created, you've now protected. And these documents and these strategies address the need to kind of protect the overall asset base and financial plan that you've built. A comprehensive financial plan is going to include strong estate planning pretty much for anyone, because it addresses a broad base of circumstances. Basic wills, for example, are needed pretty much by everyone. It outlines what happens if you pass away, what happens to your assets. So for the most part, everyone with assets would want to have some form of directive of how that would play out. But certainly, particularly once you have a family and a spouse and children, that becomes even more critical to have laid out your wishes and what you want to happen if something happens to you. It may not be the first point of discussion in an overall financial plan situation or meeting, but it's going to come up for the most part in every situation because it's a part of any financial plan that's covering all of its ends. Certainly, children make a will probably even more necessary than otherwise, because one of the critical decisions parents have to make is if something happened to them, what would they want to happen to their children? So while a will is generally dealing with finances and assets, what happens to my money, what happens to my home and my cars, in a case of children, the determination is what happens to my children, who's going to take care of my children, not only physically protect them and take them through life the way that you would have wanted to, but also financially. And those two individuals or groups of individuals may not be the same. You may have someone who's taking care of them, the custody of them, and physically protecting them and taking care of them, and you may have someone different who's handling their money so that you have kind of separation of those duties. But certainly children make a will even more critical than it already was to have in place in the first place. So I think it's something that if you haven't addressed it already before you had children, you would likely want to be sure to do that once you have had children because of that critical issue that arises. Similar to the insurance professional that we ordinarily would bring into the fold after we've determined what someone's insurance needs are, we would sit down with a client and review and assess their estate planning needs, what documents they should have in place if they don't have them in place already, looking at the possibility of incorporating trust into their overall strategies, and trying to outline what their true needs are and create a parameter that we need to bring to an attorney then to address those needs. Because ultimately, you want to have a good legal representation on the team, basically, to address these needs and build the documents that are needed to make sure that your assets are protected, that the trust that you may need are in place, and that all of the documents that are associated with a full, complete estate plan have been addressed and completed. Once the plan is kind of structured and the needs are assessed, we would want to sit down with a legal representative who can handle these issues and address these concerns that we would have from the estate planning perspective. The key element from a client perspective for us is that we can be a central point to address all of these needs from and assure that the plan is consistent and focused on the individual client, and then determine outside of the realm of the services that we're working with them on what we need in addition. So if we need an insurance professional to address a particular insurance need that we've assessed is critical, then we can work with an insurance professional to do that. And the same on the estate planning side, finding the right attorney, the right legal representation that a client might need to address those estate planning needs or those asset protection needs. So really acting with them like a quarterback and addressing what the needs are and what the strategies might need to be that need to be implemented, but working with them to find those individuals and help them to optimize the services that would be provided from them as well. From an estate planning perspective, when you're sitting down with an attorney and putting together your documents, generally they're going to include some very basic needs that everybody should have in place. So the will, absolutely, the will outlining what happens to your assets if you die and who gets them and what your specific wishes and directives are for those. But also things like powers of attorney documents so that if you were unable to make decisions for yourself relative to finances or other circumstances in your life, you assign someone who could do that for you. And so incorporating a power of attorney document to achieve that is critical to a general set of estate planning documents. And something like health directives, where if you had a healthcare issue and you're unable to make your own personal decisions about your health care, assigning someone who would do that for you or could take care of that for you. So generally, when you're looking at your estate planning documents with an attorney, you're going to focus on those critical areas and make sure they're all covered with the package that you put together ultimately. Trusts are oftentimes a very big component of estate planning and a big selling point sometimes from the estate planning industry. Kind of draws in the attention of individuals to what my estate planning needs might be. So trusts definitely have a place in a good, solid estate plan, but there are many different kinds of trusts, and sometimes there can be misconceptions about what a trust will do for you. So for example, a living trust is a very common trust that attorneys will utilize with clients to put together an estate plan. But the focus on that is really to just transfer assets from an individual into what they call a living trust. And in effect, they're still one and the same. There is not any true asset protection associated with a living trust, meaning you don't necessarily achieve any protection against a long-term care illness, for example, or a lawsuit that might arise. You as an individual are still the owner of those assets. But what it does generally is if you pass away, instead of the assets that you have having to be processed through probate, the trust itself will determine the ultimate place that those assets go to. So it provides more of a bypass of probate process as opposed to any type of particular asset protection. And sometimes the the misconception is that the living trust is actually providing certain asset protection to an individual. There are some trusts other than living trusts that could provide that asset protection. Attorneys will work with us and clients to incorporate into a good plan. So for example, you may consider putting your home into a trust to protect it from a long-term care issue or from a potential legal issue that might arise in the future. But the point being that you're literally forming a separate entity that legally owns your home, and it's protected to some extent against those possible occurrences down the road. So unlike a living trust, a trust that you would incorporate into your home would actually provide some asset protection. And similarly, irrevocable trusts offer an asset protection that a living trust would not provide. But the very critical distinguishing factor for an irrevocable trust is that you're literally taking an asset that you own and putting it into a separate legal entity, and the ownership of that asset actually changes. So in fact, if there are issues down the road related to long-term care illnesses, or if you have a legal claim against you, similar to a trust that you might put your home into, you've actually got some asset protection because there's a separate legal entity that owns that. But obviously there's many other factors to consider that come with that, like the fact that someone no longer owns that asset, and now their utilization of that asset or the benefits that they might be able to realize from that asset is not the same as when they were the owner. So it's a matter of really looking at asset protection needs and estate planning needs and determining where trusts fit into that equation, because it's a very complex arena, and sometimes trusts are needed, sometimes they're not. And so whether someone should be incorporating them into their overall estate plan is something that really should be looked at first, and that assessment be made before you're looking at incorporating these particular strategies into your plan. So one of the areas of trust that are very unique or specific to someone's particular needs is a special needs trust. Oftentimes, someone with children who have special needs, they may have a disability, there may be some issue or circumstance with their child that they want to assure they're protected and secured throughout their lifetime, and they can utilize a special needs trust to address those issues. Generally, they are for the benefit of a particular child that has these special needs, and a trustee is incorporated or put in place to assure that that child is taken care of within the parameters and the outline of what's in the special needs trust. So it allows someone to determine what they want to set aside for somebody and make sure that those funds or those assets are being used to take care of that individual in a particular manner. And oftentimes a special needs trust is established to assure that if there are programs or benefits or any types of aid that that individual is receiving, the special needs trust itself would not impact those benefits or programs or aid that they may be receiving. They still could continue to receive those things and have this special needs trust set aside for them. Whereas oftentimes if money was just distributed to an individual in that scenario and a special needs trust wasn't used, it could impact the benefit or aid that they're receiving from those programs. So it's a way to address specifically an individual's needs who may have a unique situation. When you're establishing trust, you're doing it for a future generation or your family or for loved ones because you're in effect trying to protect your assets to be intact and able to be utilized by someone else in the future. So for example, if you set up a trust because you're concerned about a possible issue arising down the road that could affect an asset, you put the asset in that trust and you determine that it's for somebody in the future, and it kind of segregates it or separates it from you as an individual so that it's protected against those possible issues that might arise. But they're really to try to make sure that the assets you have are being utilized and going to the individuals that you want them to in the future if something happens to you. So they're really for family and loved ones or particular individuals, or could even be set up to be for organizations or charitable groups that you may want to make sure are addressed in the long term with the assets that you've accumulated. Trust can fit into a broad range of requirements, but certainly a standard estate plan doesn't have to have a trust in it. So the determination really initially is based on someone's individual circumstances. Do they have a need for a trust? And why would they be incorporating a trust into their overall plan? Someone with a child with special needs, for example, may need a trust for that particular circumstance. Or someone may have a very significant objective of protecting their home, and so they might utilize a trust to protect their home. Certainly, as your wealth accumulates more and more significantly, a trust is going to be a potential strategy need that you'll have inside an overall plan more often as your wealth accumulates. So while significant wealth may be a critical reason for someone to need to utilize a trust in their big picture financial plan, it doesn't mean that you have to have a lot of money before a trust would be needed. You may have a particular circumstance or a particular need that you want to address or asset you want to protect, and that's where a trust could come into play as well. So it could be a pretty broad spectrum of individuals who might need a trust as part of their overall plan. So in the next series of videos, we're going to dig a little deeper into the specific areas and specific topics of financial planning and address particular strategies that you should be focusing on or considering, and ways within those strategies to really review specific issues that you should be addressing as you're looking at each of these particular strategies. So digging a little deeper into the topics of financial planning and expanding on the specific issues related to those areas.